What if the restlessness you have been feeling is not confusion at all, but the first signal that something ancient inside you is trying to wake up? There are moments in life that do not arrive with clarity. They arrive as pressure. A quiet tension in your chest. A subtle sense that something is no longer aligned. You look at your life, and on the surface, everything may appear the same. The same routines, the same conversations, the same environment, and yet something feels off. As if you are no longer fully inside the version of reality you once inhabited so naturally. This is where most people try to fix something external. They change environments, relationships, goals, hoping the discomfort will disappear. But what if this feeling is not a problem to solve, but a signal to understand? What if this internal friction is the beginning of a deeper shift in consciousness? Because awakening rarely begins with clarity. It begins with disruption. A question emerges, sometimes softly, sometimes with urgency. Is this really all there is? And once that question becomes real, something irreversible happens. The structures that once felt solid begin to feel fragile. The narratives you trusted start to lose their authority. And the world, as you perceived it, starts to open. You begin to notice things you couldn't see before. Patterns, contradictions, emotional reactions that no longer make sense. And alongside that, a growing awareness that the chaos unfolding around you may not be random at all. What if what looks like disorder is actually revelation? What if the world is not falling apart, but revealing what has always been hidden, so something new can emerge? And more importantly, what if this shift is not just happening around you, but through you? What if this isn't your first awakening, but your second, and that's why everything feels quieter, deeper, and far more real? The first awakening tends to be external. It shakes you. It pulls your attention toward the world, and makes you question what you once accepted without resistance. You begin to see through illusions, systems, expectations, inherited beliefs. It can feel intense, even destabilizing, because it removes the structure that once gave you a sense of certainty. But the second awakening does not operate in that same direction. It does not push you outward. It pulls you inward. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with the world?" you begin asking something far more powerful. What within me is still reacting to it? And that question changes everything. Because now, the focus is no longer on controlling what is happening outside, but on understanding the mechanisms inside that interpret it. You begin to notice your patterns, your emotional triggers, your automatic reactions. Not with judgment, but with awareness. And in that awareness, something unexpected begins to emerge: space. You start to feel less reactive, even in situations that once consumed you. The same external chaos may still exist, but your relationship to it begins to shift. You observe more. You respond less impulsively. You feel a growing sense of internal stability that does not depend on circumstances aligning perfectly. And from that stability, clarity arises. You begin to sense that your power was never in controlling reality, but in how you relate to it. And this opens a deeper question. If your inner state is becoming more grounded while the external world remains unpredictable, which one is truly shaping your experience of reality? If this is resonating with you, subscribe to the channel and like the video so you don't miss what comes next. What if this life is not a random sequence of events, but a structured environment designed for your evolution? At some point in this deeper awakening, a quiet but profound shift begins to take place. You stop seeing life as something that is simply happening to you, and you start sensing that there may be an underlying architecture to it. Not rigid, not controlling, but intentional. As if every experience, every challenge, Every unexpected turn carries a layer of meaning that goes beyond the surface. Imagine for a moment that Earth is not just a place you were born into, but a kind of learning environment, a space where consciousness comes to expand, to experience contrast, to develop awareness through real, lived moments. In this perspective, the difficulties you've faced are no longer random obstacles. They become part of a larger design, one that invites growth, not punishment. This doesn't mean that pain is pleasant or that struggle should be romanticized, but it reframes the experience. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you begin asking, "What is this trying to show me?" And that shift alone starts to return power to you. Because if life is a kind of school, then every situation becomes a lesson. Every interaction becomes feedback. Every emotional response becomes information. And suddenly your role is no longer passive. You are participating in your own evolution. But here is where it becomes even more intriguing. If this is a learning environment, then what exactly did you come here to learn? What if the reason you've struggled to understand who you truly are is because you were never meant to remember it right away? There's a concept that appears again and again in deep states of awareness, a kind of veil. Not a physical barrier, but a subtle forgetting that seems to occur the moment consciousness enters the human experience. You are born without access to the full memory of what you are, where you come from, or why you are here. And for most of your life, you build an identity based only on what you can see, touch, and be told. But what if that forgetting is not a flaw, but a feature? Because think about it. If you arrived here fully aware of your infinite nature, fully certain of your purpose, fully connected to everything beyond this reality, would this experience have the same depth? Would your choices carry the same weight? Would growth even be necessary? The veil creates the conditions for discovery. It allows you to experience limitation, contrast, and uncertainty, so that awareness can be developed from within, rather than imposed from outside. It turns life into a process of remembering, not learning for the first time. And this is why awakening feels so personal. It's not about adopting new beliefs, it's about dissolving what you thought you were, layer by layer. The roles, the labels, the inherited narratives, they begin to lose their hold. Until one question starts to surface more clearly than ever. If everything you've been told about yourself is incomplete, then who are you really? What if the version of you that you've been protecting, improving, and trying to validate is not who you truly are? At a certain point in this awakening, the question stops being philosophical and becomes deeply personal. Because when you begin to peel back the layers of identity, your roles, your achievements, your past, your fears, you start to notice something unsettling. Almost everything you've called me is something you learned, adopted, or reacted into. Your personality, your preferences, even your limitations, they were shaped over time. So then, who is the one observing all of that? There is a quiet awareness behind your thoughts, a presence that does not change, even when everything else does. It was there when you were younger, and it is still here now. It has watched every version of you come and go, without ever becoming any of them. And yet, you rarely identify with it because it is not loud, reactive, or dramatic. It simply is. This is where a profound realization begins to emerge. You are not just a human navigating reality. You are a conscious being experiencing it through a human lens. The body, the mind, the emotions, they are instruments. Powerful ones, yes, but still instruments. And when you begin to recognize this, something shifts. The need to defend every thought weakens. The urgency to prove your identity softens. You create space between who you are and what you experience. But that opens an even deeper question. If you are not limited to this identity, then what becomes possible when you stop holding on to it? What if the hardest moments of your life were never evidence that something had gone wrong, but part of the very design that could wake you up? This is one of the most difficult ideas for the mind to accept because the mind wants comfort, predictability, and control. It wants to believe that pain means failure, that loss means punishment, that emotional intensity means life is turned against you. But what if that interpretation is incomplete? What if both joy and suffering are part of a larger architecture of expansion, one that the soul, unlike the ego, understands far better than the personality ever could? Think about the moments that changed you most. Rarely were they the easiest ones. More often, they were the seasons that broke your certainty, humbled your identity, or forced you to question the life you were living. Pain has a way of interrupting autopilot. It exposes attachments. It reveals fears. It brings hidden patterns to the surface. And although no one consciously seeks suffering, many awaken only when the old self can no longer survive unchanged. This does not mean every wound should be glorified. It means every experience contains information. Even heartbreak, even betrayal, even the periods when you felt abandoned by life itself. Within them, there may have been a hidden invitation to become more conscious, more honest, more inwardly aligned. And once you begin to see challenge this way, a new question appears. If even your pain was not meaningless, then what has it been trying to teach you all along? What if the reality you've always assumed was the only one is just one layer within a much larger field of consciousness? As your awareness expands, something subtle but profound begins to shift. You start to sense that reality may not be as fixed, as solid, or as isolated as it once appeared. The idea that existence is limited to what can be seen, measured, or physically verified starts to feel incomplete. Not because you abandon logic, but because your direct experience begins to point beyond it. Across different disciplines, quantum physics, consciousness studies, and even ancient philosophies, there is a recurring suggestion. Reality is not a single, closed system. It is layered, dynamic, and responsive. The observer is not separate from what is observed. In fact, the act of observing itself influences the outcome. This alone begins to challenge everything you thought you knew about cause and effect. And when you apply this to your own life, it becomes deeply personal. If reality is responsive, then your thoughts, emotions, and expectations are not passive, they are participatory. You are not just witnessing your life. You are interacting with a field that is constantly reflecting and reorganizing based on your internal state. This is where the concept of other realities begins to make more sense, not as distant places, but as different frequencies of perception, different ways of experiencing existence based on awareness. And this leads to a powerful question. If reality is not fixed, then how much of what you experience is actually being shaped by how you perceive it? What if the direction of human consciousness shifted long before you were born, and you are living inside the consequences of that turning point? There are moments in history that don't just change events, they alter trajectories. Not only technologically, not only politically, but at the level of consciousness itself. The mid-20th century marked one of those thresholds. Humanity discovered the power to create and to destroy on a scale never seen before. For the first time, the survival of the entire species became a real, immediate possibility and a real, immediate risk. But what if that moment was more than a scientific breakthrough? What if it was a mirror? Because when a civilization reaches the ability to end itself, it is forced, whether consciously or not, to confront a deeper question. What are we actually doing with our awareness? And from that point forward, something began to accelerate. Not just innovation, but exposure. Not just progress, but polarity. Systems intensified. Narratives sharpened. Division became more visible. As if everything hidden beneath the surface began rising faster than before. This is where awakening intersects with history. Because the more power humanity gained externally, the more urgent internal awareness became. Without it, the imbalance grows. With it, a different path becomes possible. And this is why your awakening now feels so significant. You are not separate from this trajectory. You are part of the response to it. So the question becomes, if humanity reached a point where external power outpaced internal awareness, could your awakening be part of restoring that balance? What if your presence in this moment in time is not accidental, but a conscious choice made before you ever arrived here? As you go deeper into this awakening, a subtle but powerful idea begins to surface, one that can feel both empowering and unsettling at the same time. The idea that you are not just someone who was born into this world by chance, but someone who, at a deeper level of consciousness, chose to be here now. Not in a passive way, but with intention. There is a recurring pattern in many accounts of expanded awareness, the sense that certain souls or conscious beings align themselves with specific periods of transformation. Moments where the direction of humanity is shifting, where new possibilities are emerging, and where awareness itself is evolving. And instead of observing from a distance, they step into the experience. If this is true, even as a perspective to explore, it changes how you see your life. Your challenges are no longer random. Your sensitivity, your questioning, your inability to fully fit into old structures, they begin to make sense. You are not out of place. You are responding to something that is already unfolding. This is why so many people feel an unexplainable pull right now. A sense that something important is happening, even if they can't define it clearly. A feeling that their role is not to wait for change, but to embody it. And that leads to a deeper question. If you chose to be here during a time of transformation, what is it that you came here to activate within yourself? What if this shift you're feeling isn't happening to you alone, but is part of a collective movement unfolding across the entire planet? One of the most profound realizations in this stage of awakening is recognizing that your experience, as personal as it feels, is not isolated. There is a pattern emerging across millions of individuals, people who have never met, who live in different parts of the world, who follow completely different belief systems, yet are arriving at similar insights at the same time. They begin questioning the same structures, sensing the same misalignment, feeling the same pull inward. It's as if something beneath the surface of humanity is synchronizing, quietly but undeniably. And this is what distinguishes this moment from previous awakenings in history. In the past, deep awareness was often limited to small groups, mystics, philosophers, isolated seekers. The expansion of consciousness was slow, fragmented, and often hidden. But now, something is accelerating. Information travels instantly. Experiences are shared globally. Patterns become visible faster. And awareness begins to spread not as an isolated event, but as a collective phenomenon. This doesn't mean everyone is awakening at the same pace, but it does mean the field itself is changing. The baseline of perception is shifting. What once felt unquestionable now feels unstable. What once felt hidden is becoming visible. And when you begin to see your awakening as part of something larger, it changes your perspective. You are no longer just navigating your own transformation. You are participating in a collective one. So the question becomes, if humanity is evolving together, how does your individual awareness contribute to that shared shift? What if the chaos you see in the world is not evidence that things are getting worse, but proof that more is being revealed than ever before? It's easy to look at the current state of the world and feel overwhelmed. Conflict, uncertainty, emotional intensity, everything seems louder, faster, more unstable. And the mind naturally interprets this as decline, as if something is breaking down beyond repair. But what if that interpretation is incomplete? Because visibility is not the same as creation. Just because something is being seen now does not mean it didn't exist before. It means it is no longer hidden. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of awakening. When awareness rises, it does not immediately create harmony, it exposes what was out of alignment. Patterns that operated silently become impossible to ignore. Systems built on unconscious behavior begin to crack. Personal shadows, fear, control, insecurity rise to the surface, not to punish you, but to be seen clearly for the first time. And this process can feel like chaos, because from the perspective of the old identity, it is destabilizing. It removes certainty. It challenges comfort. It forces confrontation with what was easier to avoid. But from a deeper perspective, this exposure is necessary. You cannot transform what you cannot see. You cannot shift what remains hidden. So the question becomes, if everything that is surfacing right now is being revealed, are you witnessing destruction, or are you witnessing the beginning of clarity? What if the emotions that feel most overwhelming right now are not just reactions, but mechanisms that have been shaping your reality all along? As awareness deepens, you begin to notice something that was once invisible. Your emotional state is not simply a response to life. It is a filter through which life is experienced. And more than that, it is a signal that interacts with the very structure of reality itself. Most people are conditioned to live within a narrow emotional range dominated by fear, stress, urgency, and comparison. These states feel normal because they are familiar. But familiarity does not mean alignment. It often means conditioning. And when the mind operates from these lower frequency states, perception narrows. Possibilities seem limited. Reactions become automatic. And control becomes external. This is where another layer of awakening begins. You start to see that fear and anger are not just personal experiences, they are powerful states that influence behavior, decision-making, and even collective dynamics. When these emotions dominate, they create fragmentation. Division becomes easier. Manipulation becomes more effective. Not because people are weak, but because awareness is reduced. But the moment you observe this, something changes. You are no longer fully inside the emotion, you are aware of it. And awareness begins to dissolve its unconscious power. This is not about suppressing what you feel. It is about recognizing what is driving it. And that leads to a crucial question. If your emotional state shapes how you perceive and interact with reality, what happens when you begin to consciously choose it? What if consciousness itself has levels and your entire experience of reality shifts as you move through them? As your awareness deepens, you begin to recognize that not all states of being are equal. There is a spectrum, subtle but undeniable, ranging from contraction to expansion, from fear to clarity, from reactivity to presence. And what defines your experience at any given moment is not what is happening externally, but where you are positioned on that internal scale. At lower levels of consciousness, perception is filtered through survival. The mind is focused on threat, control, comparison, and validation. Everything feels personal. Everything feels urgent. You react quickly, often without awareness, because your system is operating in protection mode. In this state, reality appears fragmented, unpredictable, and often overwhelming. But as you begin to move upward, through awareness, observation, and intentional choice, something shifts. The same external circumstances may remain, but your relationship to them changes. You become less reactive, more responsive. You begin to see patterns instead of isolated events. You experience moments of neutrality, where you are no longer pulled into every emotional wave. And beyond that, there are even higher states, where clarity, compassion, and presence become your baseline, not as an effort, but as a natural expression of alignment. In these states, reality feels more fluid, less resistant, more responsive. This is where the law of attraction begins to make deeper sense, not as a superficial concept, but as a reflection of your internal position. So the question becomes, if your level of consciousness determines how you experience reality, where are you currently operating from, and what would change if you moved higher? What if the moment you become aware of what is influencing you is the exact moment you begin to take your power back? There is a subtle but decisive shift that happens in awakening, and it has nothing to do with changing your external circumstances. It begins the instant you realize that much of what has been shaping your thoughts, emotions, and reactions has been operating without your conscious awareness. Patterns you inherited, narratives you absorbed, emotional responses you never questioned. They felt like you, but they were conditioned. And here is the turning point. Once you see it, you can no longer unsee it. Awareness breaks the automatic cycle. It creates space between stimulus and response. That space may feel small at first, almost insignificant, but it is where your power lives. Because in that space, you are no longer reacting unconsciously. You are choosing. This is not about controlling everything you feel or think. It is about recognizing that you are not defined by it. You can observe fear without becoming it. You can notice a limiting belief without obeying it. You can feel an emotional surge and still decide how you respond. And the more you practice this, the more that space expands. What once triggered you instantly now gives you a moment of clarity. What once controlled you begins to lose its grip. This is how external influence weakens, not by force, but by awareness. And this leads to a powerful realization. If awareness dissolves unconscious control, how much of your life begins to change the moment you truly see what has been running it? What if the divisions you see everywhere are not accidental, but part of a system that keeps awareness fragmented? As you move deeper into this awakening, you begin to notice a pattern that once felt normal. Everything is presented in opposition. Right or wrong, us or them, success or failure, agreement or rejection. These polarities seem natural at first, but the more you observe them, the more you realize how much they shape perception. Because when the mind is locked into polarity, it stops seeing clearly. It becomes reactive, defensive, and emotionally invested in maintaining a position. And in that state, awareness narrows. You are no longer observing reality. You are defending an identity within it. This is how division sustains itself. Not only through external systems, but through internal attachment. The need to be right. The need to belong. The need to oppose something in order to define yourself. And the more this dynamic intensifies, the easier it becomes to distract, manipulate, and fragment collective attention. But awakening begins to dissolve this pattern, not by forcing neutrality, but by revealing the mechanism behind the reaction. You start to see that both sides of any polarity often exist within the same system, that what you resist externally may reflect something unresolved internally, and that true clarity does not come from choosing a side. It comes from seeing beyond the division itself. This does not make you passive. It makes you precise. And this opens a deeper question. If stepping out of polarity expands your awareness, What happens when you stop reacting and start seeing clearly? What if the reality you've been navigating is only one layer of perception and you're already beginning to shift beyond it? At a deeper level of awakening, you start to sense that what people call reality is not fixed, it is interpreted. The same situation can feel threatening or neutral, limiting or expansive, depending entirely on the state from which it is perceived. And this is where the idea of shifting levels of consciousness becomes more tangible. What many describe as a 3D experience is not about a physical dimension, but a mode of perception dominated by duality, reaction, and identification. In this state, everything feels divided, right versus wrong, gain versus loss, self versus others. The mind constantly evaluates, defends, and reacts, creating a loop where external circumstances dictate internal experience. But as awareness deepens, something begins to loosen. You are no longer pulled into every contrast. You begin to observe without immediate judgment. You recognize that not every thought requires agreement, and not every emotion requires action. This is where a shift occurs, from reaction to awareness. And from that awareness, a new level of perception becomes available. One where neutrality replaces urgency, where clarity replaces confusion, where you begin to see that you are not inside the experience, you are aware of it. This is what higher consciousness feels like, not escape, but expanded perception. And this leads to a powerful realization. If your experience of reality changes when your awareness shifts, then what you call reality may be far more flexible than you ever imagined. What if the pace of change you're feeling is not your imagination, but the beginning of an acceleration that will reshape how reality responds to you? There are periods in human experience where change unfolds gradually, almost invisibly. And then there are moments where everything begins to move faster. Ideas spread instantly, technologies evolve rapidly, and inner transformations that once took years begin to compress into months, even weeks. You may have already sensed this acceleration in your own life. Patterns that once felt fixed are shifting more quickly. Realizations arrive with greater intensity. Decisions carry deeper consequences. But what if this acceleration is not just external? Because as awareness rises, the connection between your internal state and your external experience becomes more immediate. What you think, what you feel, what you expect, it begins to reflect back to you with less delay. The gap between cause and effect starts to close. And with that, manifestation is no longer something abstract. It becomes observable. This can feel empowering or overwhelming, because when reality responds faster, your level of responsibility increases. You can no longer ignore your internal patterns and expect neutral outcomes. What you carry within you begins to organize what appears around you. This is why this phase is often described as a turning point. Not because something outside is taking control, but because the system itself is becoming more responsive to consciousness. And this raises an essential question. If reality is beginning to mirror you more quickly than ever, are you aware of what you are consistently projecting into it? What if nothing outside you is actually changing first, but simply reflecting a shift that already happened within you? As your awareness deepens, a subtle but profound realization begins to settle in. Reality is not something you are merely experiencing. It is something you are participating in. Not through force, not through control, but through resonance. Your beliefs, your emotional patterns, your sense of identity, they are not passive. They act like filters, selecting, organizing, and even attracting the version of reality that matches them. At first, this idea can feel uncomfortable because it challenges the of seeing life as something that happens to you. It asks you to consider that your external world may be mirroring something internal, not as blame, but as feedback. And once you begin to see this, patterns become visible in a way they never were before. You notice how the same types of situations repeat. The same emotional triggers appear in different forms. The same outcomes emerge, even when the circumstances change. And instead of asking, "Why does this keep happening?" you begin to ask, "What within me is consistent enough to keep recreating this?" This is where real transformation begins. Not by forcing change externally, but by shifting the internal pattern that generates it. Because when the internal state changes, the external reflection has no choice but to reorganize. And this leads to a powerful realization. If reality mirrors who you are being, then what version of yourself are you consistently projecting into the world? What if the part of you that reacts the fastest is not your truth, but a survival pattern that is now being exposed? As your awareness expands, you begin to notice how quickly certain reactions arise within you. A comment triggers defensiveness. A situation creates anxiety. A memory pulls you into a familiar emotional loop. And for a long time, these reactions felt automatic, almost justified, as if they were simply part of who you are. But what if they are not? What if many of these responses were formed at a time when your system was trying to protect you, not express your true nature? Patterns built through repetition, reinforced by past experiences, and anchored in a version of reality where survival meant staying alert, guarded, and prepared. These patterns are efficient, but they are not always accurate. And this is where awakening begins to challenge them. Not by removing them instantly, but by bringing them into awareness. You start to see the moment before the reaction, the subtle tension, the familiar narrative beginning to form. And for the first time, you recognize it as something you can observe, not something you must obey. This is what it means for the ego to be exposed, not destroyed, but understood. Its role is never to limit you, but to protect you based on past information. The problem is that it continues to operate even when the context has changed. And this leads to a deeper question. If your reactions are not always aligned with who you are now, what happens when you stop identifying with them and begin choosing from awareness instead? What if you are not here to wait for the world to change, but to become the frequency that initiates the change itself? At a certain point in this awakening, something shifts in how you relate to transformation. You stop looking outward for permission, validation, or confirmation that change is happening. Because you begin to understand something deeper. Reality does not reorganize because enough people complain about it. It reorganizes when enough consciousness embodies a different state. This is where responsibility stops feeling like pressure and starts feeling like power. Because if your internal state influences your perception, your decisions, and your interactions, then it also influences the field you are participating in. Every moment, you are transmitting something through your attention, your emotion, your presence. Not as a metaphor, but as a measurable energetic pattern that interacts with everything around you. This is why waiting becomes unnecessary. The moment you shift internally, you are already contributing to a different version of reality. Not by forcing outcomes, but by no longer reinforcing the old patterns that sustain them. You become less reactive, more intentional, less dependent on external conditions, more anchored in internal clarity. And from that state, your actions carry a different quality. They are not driven by fear or urgency. They are aligned, precise, and grounded. And this is where true influence begins. So the question becomes, if you are already affecting the field through who you are being, what kind of reality are you reinforcing with your current state? What if every moment of your life is not something you pass through, but something you are constantly choosing, whether you realize it or not? As your awareness deepens, A subtle but transformative idea begins to take hold. You are not just reacting to life, you are assigning meaning to it. And that meaning becomes the lens through which everything else is experienced. Two people can go through the same situation and walk away with completely different realities, not because the event changed, but because the interpretation did. This is where one of the most powerful shifts begins, what could be called the moment of conscious choosing. Instead of automatically labeling an experience as good or bad, success or failure, you begin to pause. You recognize that the meaning you give something is not fixed, it is selected. And in that selection, you are shaping your emotional state, your perspective, and ultimately, your trajectory. This does not mean denying reality or pretending everything is positive. It means recognizing that your interpretation is part of the creation process. When something challenging happens, you can unconsciously reinforce limitation, or you can consciously extract direction. You can collapse into reaction, or you can expand into awareness. This is the difference between living on autopilot and living intentionally. And the more you practice this, the more you realize something profound. Your power is not in controlling what happens. It is in choosing how you relate to it. So the question becomes, if you are always choosing, even when you're not aware of it, what would change if you began choosing consciously? What if your emotional baseline, the state you return to most often, is quietly shaping everything that unfolds in your life? Beyond isolated reactions, there is something more consistent operating beneath the surface, your internal set point, the state you default to when nothing is actively demanding your attention. For many, this baseline is built unconsciously over time, formed by repeated thoughts, reinforced by past experiences, and stabilized by the nervous system's need for familiarity. If your baseline is stress, you will find reasons to feel stressed. If it is doubt, you will notice what confirms it. If it is calm, clarity begins to emerge more naturally. Not because reality has changed, but because your perception and your response has. This is where the idea of raising your vibration becomes more precise. It is not about forcing yourself into temporary positivity. It is about gradually shifting your baseline through consistent awareness, emotional regulation, and intentional focus. It is about training your system to feel safe in states that once felt unfamiliar, like peace, presence, or self-trust. At first, this can feel unnatural. The mind may resist. The body may pull you back into old patterns. But with repetition, something stabilizes. The higher state becomes less of an effort and more of a default. And once your baseline shifts, your experience follows. So the question becomes, if your life reflects the state you return to most often, what state are you rehearsing every day without realizing it? What if the real awakening has never been about escaping reality, but about transforming how you exist within it? At this stage, something becomes unmistakably clear. Awakening is not a destination you arrive at. It is a shift in how you relate to every moment you experience. It is not about leaving the world behind, rejecting it, or rising above it in some abstract sense. It is about becoming fully present within it, without being unconsciously controlled by it. You begin to notice the difference between reacting and responding, between being pulled by emotion and observing it, between identifying with every thought and recognizing that thoughts are simply passing signals, not absolute truths. And this distinction changes everything. Because when you are no longer fully identified with what happens, you create space. And in that space, awareness expands. You start to experience life with a different quality, not detached in a cold way, but grounded in a deeper clarity. You are still engaged, still participating, but no longer consumed by every fluctuation. This is where the movement from fear to presence becomes real, not as an idea, but as a lived experience. You feel it in how you handle uncertainty, in how you move through discomfort, in how you relate to others, not from lack, but from connection. And from this state, something else emerges, a sense that separation itself was never as solid as it appeared. So the question becomes, if awakening is not about leaving reality, but embodying awareness within it, how differently would you begin to live? What if the boundaries you perceive between yourself and everything else are not as solid as they seem? As awareness deepens, a quiet realization begins to take shape, one that doesn't arrive as a concept, but as a shift in perception. The sense of separation you once took for granted starts to feel less absolute. You begin to notice how deeply interconnected everything is, not only externally, through relationships and environments, but internally, through the way your thoughts, emotions, and energy ripple outward and return in unexpected ways. You start to see others differently, not just as separate individuals moving through their own lives, but as reflections, mirrors revealing aspects of your own consciousness. The reactions they trigger, the emotions they evoke, the patterns they activate, all of it becomes information. Not about them alone, but about you as well. This doesn't eliminate individuality. It expands it, because you begin to understand that connection does not require sameness. It reveals underlying unity beneath difference. And with this realization comes a subtle but powerful shift in how you engage with the world. What you express, whether it's fear, judgment, compassion, or presence, doesn't stop with you. It enters the field. It interacts. It returns, often amplified. This is where the idea of giving and receiving becomes more than a principle. It becomes a lived dynamic. So the question becomes, if everything you project into the world is part of an interconnected exchange, what are you consistently contributing to that field? What if this moment, right now, is not just another point in time, but a threshold where you decide who you are becoming? After everything you've seen, questioned, and felt, the realization begins to settle in a different way. Awakening is not something that happens once and then ends. It is a continuous invitation, a series of moments where awareness either deepens or contracts. And the difference is not determined by what happens around you, but by how consciously you meet it. You begin to understand that transformation does not come from waiting for the perfect conditions. It comes from embodying a different state within the conditions you already have. Every reaction becomes a choice point, every thought a direction, every emotion an opportunity to either reinforce the past or step into something new. This is where identity becomes fluid, not unstable but no longer fixed by history. You are not bound to repeat the same patterns unless you remain unconscious of them. The moment you see clearly, you create the possibility to choose differently. And that choice, repeated consistently, begins to redefine your entire experience. You are no longer searching for change. You are generating it. And this is the final shift. You are not separate from the transformation you've been waiting for. You are the mechanism through which it happens. So the question becomes, now that you can see more clearly than before, who are you choosing to be from this moment forward? If this message resonated with you, subscribe to the channel and follow for more content that expands your awareness. Like this video so more people can access this perspective. And share it with someone who is ready to see beyond what they've been told.